You are listening to The Tatiana Show. This show may contain adult content, language, and humor and is intended for mature audiences. If that's not you, please stop listening. Nothing you hear on The Tatiana Show is intended as financial advice, legal advice, or really anything other than entertainment. Take everything you hear with a grain of salt. Oh, and if you're listening to us on an affiliate network, the ideas and views expressed on this show are not necessarily those of the network that you're listening on or of any sponsors or any affiliate products you may hear about on this show. Now that that's squared away, let's start the show. Hey there, it's time for the show, The Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. Thank you to our sponsor, blocktap.io. Please go to their website and check out their universal cryptocurrency API to get reliable cryptocurrency data. blocktap.io. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special edition of The Tatiana Show. What makes it special? I'm not really sure, except that we're going to be talking to one of my absolute favorite guests. Whenever I recommend The Tatiana Show to people, I recommend that they check out episodes with Scott Horton. Scott is an incredible anti-war journalist. He has a show, and we'll be talking with him in just a few minutes to get the breakdown on what's happening with Iran, Venezuela, and overall, how is the war machine doing today? I am joined by my co-host, Josh Shigala from Vaultoro. Hey, Josh, nice to see you or talk to you.
It is an absolute pleasure to be back on the show and also to be talking to Scott again. What a wealth of information that guy is.
I'm super pumped. You know, the first time that I started listening to Scott, I was pretty intimidated, and I'm sure that some of the audience members are going to feel that way. But, you know, I even talked to Scott about this one time, and I said to him, you know, listen, man, I feel like I'm out of my depths. And he said, you know, if you keep listening, you're going to get a little bit more familiar with it. And I think that people, if they gave it some time, I think that they could get a little bit more educated, which is what I'm hoping to do myself. But don't be intimidated by the 50 million countries that we're invading. Scott's here to kind of enlighten us all. But before we get started, I just wanted to give a special thanks to our sponsor, Vaultoro. Josh and his team have been kind enough to support the Tatiana Show in the long term, and also Proof of Love. So I wanted to make sure that people were aware that we're very grateful for their sponsorship. And you guys are launching a new product, and there's a lot of news coming out of Vaultoro. So real quick, anything you want to tell people about, or?
Oh, just basically we're, you know, for the last, since 2015, we've been trading Bitcoin and physical allocated bullion, situated in a high security vaulting facility in Switzerland, fully insured and fully audited by one of the largest auditing firms. So we were kind of the original stablecoin without a coin. People could just trade into something that was fairly stable and could be fully allocated in your name as your property. And so that was just purely Bitcoin and gold, and people have been asking for ages for silver and other pairs. So for the last 6 months, we've been working on relaunching Vaultoro from the ground up, rebuilding it with more pairs, and that's going to be launching in very soon. I don't want to say a date, but we're in beta at the moment, in closed beta, so it's super exciting. I'm really loving our team, and it's just so much fun working on the cutting edge of technology, you know, really making a difference as well in the world and getting back to gold-based money and asset-based money when it comes to crypto, you know, real rare numbers and rare metals. Beautiful.
Yeah, well, I think that that could have a really big impact in a lot of these war-torn nations. We just did that interview, like I said, with Bob Murphy, famous economist. So he was giving us a little bit of insight in that. And Scott and I actually hung out on the Contra Krugman cruise, which is going on in July 5th to July 12th. It's not too late to get your tickets. Go to contracruise.com and you can make fun of Paul Krugman and hang out with me and go and see Alaska and learn about economics. So I think that's pretty cool. But anyway, we're going to bring Scott up. One more announcement. Thank you so much to All Tangent Labs and their amazing product, blocktap.io, another sponsor of the show. So if you guys want to get your crypto data, go to blocktap.io. Without further ado, Scott Horton, thanks so much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Hey guys, how are you doing?
Happy to be hanging with you.
Cool. I'm happy to be here.
Well, maybe one of these days we won't have bad news to discuss. But I think it's super important, all the work that you've been doing. For people who are unfamiliar with you, could you just give us a quick breakdown about your background and what you do now and how you got into that?
Yeah, well, I'm the editorial director of Antiwar.com. I'm mostly an interview show host. So my podcast is called The Scott Horton Show, but I'm on KPFK in Los Angeles, 90.7 FM. The show is called Antiwar Radio there. And I've got almost 5,000 interviews. I'm at 4,987 or something.
Wow.
So I'll be at 5,000 interviews here in just a couple of weeks.
Wow, who's going to be your 5,000th, man? Have you?
It'll have to be Gareth Porter. He's my best guy.
Nice.
What's so great about Gareth?
You know what? If I was Mr. White and he was Clark Kent, then there you go, right there. He just absolutely is on point. He writes about exactly what I would have him write about. He debunks every lie they say, and he's just absolutely reliable on essentially everything. My first interview with him was in January 2007, and he had written an article about, don't worry, Bush isn't going to attack Iran, at least not right now. He might in the early summer, but they're at least going to give it a few months. Because a lot of people at that moment were really worried that Bush was going to launch an attack right then. And Gareth had read through all the tea leaves and understood why that wasn't the case. And so that was the first interview, was him going, here's a guy who is really worried about it, but he's not letting his, bias skew his view. And he's coming up essentially an anti-alarmist on an issue that he agrees is of the highest importance. You know what I mean? He's just got the best attitude that a reporter could have for the kind of stuff he covers. So I've interviewed him more than 300 times now, far more than anyone else. I've interviewed him about essentially everything he's written in the last 12 years.
Amazing.
Yeah,
wow.
Great Gareth Porter. And he wrote the book on Iran's nuclear program. And anyway, and I wrote a book on my list of things. I wrote a book called Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan a couple of years ago, but we're still there, so it's still relevant. And there's an audio book of that if people are interested in that. It's just Fool's Errand, and my name's Scott Horton. You'll find it.
How long is the audiobook?
About 9 hours.
It seems like something that would be a little bit too intense to try and do in an audiobook. I like to do audiobooks, but that sounds like it's going to be kind of very fact-laden. And I think for me, I get really confused with all the different places and stuff like that. So it might be one that I got to read personally. I actually have a copy of that.
Yeah, well, take a look.
I know.
It's out in Kindle and EPUB too, and all kinds of things.
Awesome. So why don't we dive right into it? People know a little bit of background now, but one of the main things that brings us all together under crypto is a strong anti-war feeling. And because of the way that the money is controlled, that's how these wars are endlessly waged. Right now, we're hearing all about potentially invading Venezuela, the potential conflict with Iran, and North Korea is always in the back. What's going on the streets?
All right. Well, if you want to start with Venezuela, essentially the deal is that everything in the world is George Bush's fault, okay? In 2003, he invaded Iraq and tripled the price of oil, quadrupled it or something. It went up to, at one point, $138 a barrel, I think it was. And so for Hugo Chavez, who came into power in 1999, he called George Bush Satan and said he could smell the sulfur on him and stuff like that. It sounds to me like George Bush was his guardian angel. Okay, yes, one time he tried to do a coup d'etat and overthrow him in 2002, but that didn't work. The people came out in the streets and promised to tear the coup plotters limb from limb if they didn't put him back on the chair, back in the chair. So they did. But so George Bush made Hugo Chavez possible, the entire program. Now, when people say that, and for people who aren't familiar with me, I'm as libertarian as the next guy, probably quite a bit more. But, so I'm on everyone listening. I'm still on your side when I'm nitpicking these definitions a little bit, especially us libertarians call everything socialism. I mean, I'm even worse, right? I call everything communism. Even to have a sheriff's department is communism, from each according to his ability to each according to his security needs, right? Like, I'm against all of it. At the same time, I think we have to recognize that when we're talking about nation states here in the real world, that if a country has a vast welfare state, we usually call that socialism. It's really not. Or if you want to call that socialism, then you have to differentiate that from true communism, which means the government takes ownership over all of the businesses, over all of the production, all the factories, all the farm, agricultural land, and everything is taken over by the state, is true communism. And that's not the problem in Venezuela. The problem in Venezuela is they have a welfare state, just like the United States of America has, just like Canada, just like all of the Western European countries have. They have and just like all of these other countries named here, they have more welfare state than they can afford, more socialism, if you want to call it that, than they can afford. And the main reason why is because they had this huge fuel bubble that they built the whole thing up on. And then I think, I'm trying to remember exactly when Chavez died, if it was right before he died or right after he died, the price of fuel went way, way, way back down again. And so in comes his successor, Maduro, who never had his charisma or political abilities and probably wasn't intelligent, as intelligent in terms of economics and politics and power and all those things, certainly not in his dealings with the United States. And so here he's left to essentially clean up this giant mess that Chavez made. And so it's sort of like George Bush, right? I mean, the war seemed free. Everything was great. Everybody's riding high, and look at this bubble. And then the whole thing crashes, thankfully, while he was still in power. It would have been so unfair if it fell on the next guy. But it was September 2008, the thing crashed on Bush. So at least, we could put a little bit of blame where it's due before the next guy got all the rap for it. But anyway.
How much do you think the OPEC has stuff to do with that, orchestrating that crash and manipulating Venezuela?
Well, I think that came later. So that's a great question. So first of all, it was the crash of 2008 put a huge, just crushed demand for fuel. So, you might have even seen pictures of all those giant ocean liner, 100 of them or more or something, just completely shut down. So it was such a big bubble. Demand for fuel just crashed right after that. So the price went down there. But now what you may be referring to was when John Kerry had worked a deal with the Saudis in order to try to hurt the Russians and I guess the Iranians. I think the Russians and the Iranians most, but then Venezuela absolutely, at the very least, Venezuela would have been collateral damage in the sense of the Americans and the Saudis actually deciding, let's go ahead and dump the price of oil lower in order to try to hurt the Russians and the Iranians. And so I think you're probably right that it certainly didn't help for the situation in Venezuela. But, essentially, the reason I'm trying to differentiate and say, like, they're really not communists is because it's sort of a misnomer, right? To just libertarians, we have this confirmation bias where we go, see, government doesn't work, hyperinflation. Well, you know what? There are a lot of welfare states in the world without hyperinflation. I mean, hyperinflation is caused when you refuse to cut after your fuel bubble crashes and you continue to make more and more promises and try to just print money to make it all work. Not everyone is as bad at monetary policy, even in welfare states, as Maduro and his men running the central bank of Venezuela. I mean, what they did was they ran up as much debt as they could, and then they just started printing the rest straight out of, a Misesian textbook. They expanded the monetary base by huge percentages. And so they had terrible hyperinflation. Now, and I talked with Bob Murphy about all this, and I really wish I did know a lot more about it. I think there's plenty of media to show that the shelves are not empty. People are not, I guess, they have digital currency more and more, they're using cards. So it's not like they're walking around with wheelbarrows full of cash like in Germany in the 20s or whatever, right? But, essentially, I guess the point being is they have hyperinflation. So no one can really save in the local currency. Right. So it's causing terrible disruptions to their economy. No one would argue that, but it's not causing massive shortages. And I think part of the reason for that is on at least some things, I don't know this for certain, but it seems like at least on some things, they must have lifted the price controls. I know they've had price controls and inflationary money there for a long, long time, long before Hugo Chavez ever came to power, when the right wing, so-called, was still in power. They were inflating back then too. But, I've seen reports where the grocery store shelves are full. The New York Times says you can't get a tube of toothpaste or buy an apple to eat to keep the doctor away or whatever. It's just not true.
Really?
And I've seen people go, I've seen journalists go to the government store where, of course, government can have stock shelves and take a loss, right? But I've also seen people in regular grocery stores and privately owned grocery stores in Caracas where the shelves are absolutely full of everything that you need. They're importing it from, elsewhere, mostly. They used to have a giant agricultural, or I don't know, a giant, but they used to have an agricultural sector that was really hollowed out because of the resource curse, because of the over-reliance on oil. But why work if you can buy everything for free with your free oil money? And so, their economy became more and more centralized and more dependent on that oil wealth in a lot of ways. But anyway, I mean, I've seen plenty of reporting from down there that say that Caracas is not in crisis. There's a protest on the east side of town. In the richest, whitest neighborhood, there's an anti-government protest. And out in front of the right? Especially we saw during the coup a couple of weeks ago. There's a huge protest, a bigger protest out in front of the presidential palace. That's where the revolution is, sticking up for the president against foreign intervention. And so, but meanwhile, the rest of Caracas is going about their day. Millions of people. I forget, is it 10 million people or 5 million people or something live in Caracas? And there is not a crisis. There is not a sense that what's going to happen? When's he going to get overthrown? Who's going to do it? Blah, 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 blah. American TV would have us think that it's like that. But reporters from all over the world who've gone down there have reported back that it's just not that way. I talked with a guy named Ken Silverstein from Harper's Magazine, and he is a leftist, but still. Max Blumenthal, too. And there's a blog called the Saker blog where he republished a piece by this Russian journalist. This was back, I guess, in the end of January, beginning of February, right after the first failed coup. And he was saying, this isn't going anywhere. The people of Venezuela are not about to rise up and overthrow this government. They're just not. And you could say that, well, that's because of socialism. Okay. Yeah, the government bought them all a house. All these poor people, they didn't have a house before. Now they have a house. They used to live in a cardboard shack in, one of the poorest ghettos in the Western Hemisphere. Now they have a house, they have a school, they have a hospital, and they have food to eat. They have a free tank of gas every single day. That's a hell of a bribe.
Yeah, but I mean, there are massive stories of I've got friends that have family in Venezuela who are saying the electricity is going on and off all the time.
Oh, that's certainly true. But that doesn't mean that the people are about to rise up and overthrow the government over it. They need replacement parts from Siemens in Germany to run their electric grid. Guess what? So do the Americans. And if you put a blockade on New York so that they couldn't get replacement parts from Siemens, the power would go out in New York too. And I guess then everybody would point their finger and say, see, socialism. But the government's always run the power grid in New York. They need replacement parts that are under sanctions.
So you would agree with what Ron Paul had said a few weeks ago. He had said that it was the sanctions that were really hurting people in Venezuela, and a lot of
that's a separate question. So And that's a good question. And first of all, yes, I agree with Ron Paul about just about everything, but I think it's both, right? These are not exclusive ideas at all. So the Americans want rid of these guys, and they absolutely are waging an economic war against them. And they kicked them out of SWIFT, the international currency exchange. They had the British steal all their gold. They put sanctions on Venezuelan oil, where now they can't sell essentially to anyone except the Chinese, because the Russians are oil exporters. So they don't need it. So the Chinese are buying from them, but America will put sanctions on anyone else who buys from them, like third-party sanctions. So, the U.S. government is doing everything they can, and they brag about this in their own words over and over again, to try to hurt the population of Venezuela, to make them desperate, to put pressure on them. This doesn't work. We're going to starve you until you overthrow your government for us. Doesn't work.
Yeah.
That's
But
wild.
they keep doing it anyway.
So what would you say? I mean, it's almost like you're saying like they're okay over there, but the inflation there has been bananas. So are you saying that
okay compared to what? Okay compared to what?
I don't know. Wasn't it up like 1,000,000% or something since last year? Something insane?
That is what they say. I don't know if the rate is really that high, but I know, I was talking with Bob, and he went and checked the monetary statistics from the Venezuelan central bank, and he goes, man, they increased their money supply by 30% in February or in March. So, yeah, I mean, they are absolutely printing money. And it's a vicious cycle, right? I mean, if it was you would say we have to stop printing money right now to lick this inflation. But to any liberal or leftist, when prices are rising, what do? Print more money so you can afford the higher prices.
That is so stupid of them.
And so it's a spiral. It becomes a self-reinforcing thing. And it does make sense, like in the immediate term. You've got to be able to pay your civil servants this week. If you have to print the money to keep them from being all laid off and rioting and overthrowing you, then you do that. And if you have to suffer the long-term consequences, or they do, well, then that's just the way it is. This is the difference. This is the libertarian insight always, right? In the difference between the national interest and the interests of the people who run the nation. Those are always very different things.
Yeah, the thing is that there's constant news coverage of the situation down there, but it's very, very hard to tell what's actually happening on the ground these days with a lot of the fake news. I just don't have a clue. I've got colleagues that have feet on the ground there, and what he keeps telling me is that it is quite dire, that he's sending money home, that the problem that the shops have is to restock. Yeah, they're exporting, but then, they're importing stuff, but no one wants to buy the Bolivar anymore because of the massive inflation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. I'm not saying everything's great there. I'm just saying, it's just like if we're talking about Israel, Palestine, or Iran, or anything else. It's not a matter of taking sides, right? It's not a matter of what is your identity, and so therefore, who do you line up with? I don't care about that kind of crap. If I got to hang around with Maoists all day, then I guess I got to hang out with Maoists. I'm just interested in what the truth is. So every libertarian wants to say, see, government doesn't work. Welfare state doesn't work. It causes hyperinflation, socialism, communism, inflation, and left is bad. Okay, fine. But I didn't learn anything just now from that, right? What I want to know is the actual balance of power. What does it all mean? I can tell you right now, the guy who owns the house I'm renting is a Venezuelan expat. He is an economic refugee. Him and his entire family fled Venezuela to the United States because they can't make any money. Because the government down there, before the sanctions, well, and really the sanctions have been around since Obama, but before the worst of the sanctions, I guess you could say, the government ruined the economy down there. The price of oil crashed and they created way too much money. Which absolutely, if you know anything about capitalist economics at all, you know that having the devaluing of the currency that everything is priced in throws everything into chaos. But you know what? Here's what you also know is it's the price controls that really cause the shortages. When there's hyperinflation and you're a shopkeeper, you can figure it out. When there's price controls, now it's illegal for you to figure it out. Now there's nothing you can do. The government is forcing you to sell at a loss, and you're just going to not do that and close your shop up instead, right? If you have to pay more wholesale, then the government will let you price something retail. Well, you're done. So if they're backing off some of the price controls, apparently they are. When it comes to food and toilet paper and basic, household needs, there's stuff's available. The hyperinflation has not made. So I'm not saying that people aren't poor. I'm not saying that the government hasn't destroyed the currency. I'm just saying from all the reports I've seen, there's not an atmosphere of crisis that what are we going to do about it and when are we going to do it and what are we waiting for? Come on, let's rise up and overthrow Maduro or something. It's just not happening any more than people are saying, come on, let's rise up and overthrow Trump right now. I mean, maybe some idiot says that, but it doesn't mean anything. There's no support for anything like that, That's a really fascinating insight. I want to ask you about something else, though, because I was in the Bahamas and I was looking at the TV and I caught the footage of the tank running over the protesters in Venezuela. And I was completely horrified and disgusted and really freaked out. Mm-hmm. But then I had read somewhere else that, those guys, they were throwing Molotov cocktails, blah, blah, blah. And it seems like not everybody is into this potential takeover. Can you, are there justified protests going on? Obviously, some of the protests are good, but do you think that there's a wiggle room where some of the protesters are not really quote unquote good guys? What do you think of this other guy that's trying to take power? Yeah. So, I mean, this is the thing again. I mean, if we libertarians, we're capitalists and the people running things down there are leftists. And so that's all we need to know is we're on the right and they're on the left and these are the sides, then we get really stuck, right? Because as a libertarian American, my highest priority is not the form of the economy or the amount of socialism in the economy in Venezuela. My primary objective here is anti-imperialism. I'm anti-government in the general sense, which means I'm against the Venezuelan government just as well as I'm against all governments. But I hate my government and I want to destroy it. I want it to cease to exist. I want it to do nothing to or for anyone ever again. I want to abolish it yesterday. And that is my highest priority, is discrediting the American world empire that would seek to intervene under any excuse. You think they care about Islamic extremism in Iran when they support the king of Saudi Arabia who cuts off people's heads just for protesting? In Saudi, 3 weeks ago, they crucified a bunch of Shiites just for being protesters. And their leader, they cut his head off and then crucified his corpse.
Oh, so you were serious
Those
about
America's
the specific word crucify. They literally crucified them?
They crucified the ringleader anyway. They cut all their heads off, and then they crucified the headless corpse of the ringleader. And they were just protesters. They called them terrorists. And, you know, all the American newspapers called them terrorists, too. Saudi beheads a bunch of terrorists. They weren't terrorists. They were Shiite protesters. They hadn't done anything. USA doesn't care about that. USA doesn't care about the quality of life for the average schmuck in Venezuela. Come on. These are about interests of state. And anything about how those poor people are living in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Iran, in Venezuela, in Syria, or anywhere else is nothing but a shallow, ridiculous, and transparent pretext for intervention by the American government that happens to have, hands down, by far, with no competition, the bloodiest record of the 21st century. And,
so
and for that matter, the second half of the last century, too. So
do you think the people not rising up is also a cultural thing of the type of people that that Venezuelans are? For instance, Australians are very relaxed. They put up with all sorts of crap, and they never sort of get up to anything. Whereas in France, you put the tiniest little tax in and everyone's throwing Molotov cocktails and burning cars.
Yeah. Well, I really don't know about the spirit of the Venezuelan people as far as that goes. I mean, I know that remember I mentioned the coup when Bush and a bunch of right-wing corporatists in Venezuela tried to overthrow Hugo Chavez. And they had pretty big protests. The rich white right in Venezuela number in the, I don't know, hundreds of thousands at least. So they can throw a pretty good protest. And Greg Palast was down there, and all of CNN and everyone was showing the anti-government protest, which was way bigger than the one you're talking about with the armored personnel carrier there. I'll get back to that in a second. But it was way bigger than that. It was really huge anti-Chavez protests there. And then Greg Palast reporting for the BBC goes, you see that? Look at that, man. A couple 100,000 people. Now watch this, everybody. Boom. And he turns the camera 90 degrees, or maybe it was 180 degrees. And there are millions of Chavez supporters out there. And their message is clear. If you don't put Chavez back in power, we are going to kill you. And so the coup leaders said, oh, did we say that he resigned and turned power over to us and that we abolished the Supreme Court and the thing? Yeah, we didn't mean that. Sorry, we're gone. Bye. And they left and they put Chavez back on the thing. The coup lasted overnight, essentially, something like that. There's a great documentary about this called The Revolution Will Be Televised. And so the three of us might say, these people don't know anything about economics. They should read some Thomas Sowell or something. I don't know. You know what? Doesn't matter. What matters is they have the right to be independent from us. Now, I'm an individualist anarchist. I don't really believe in states at all. And so, yes, you could argue that it's unfair for a 90-something% supermajority to oppose the 10% who want to overthrow the government there. But then again, it's wrong for the 10% who want to overthrow the government to try to inflict that on the 90% who don't. So all other things being equal, and living in a world of nation states, the people who don't want to overthrow the government in Venezuela right now are by far the majority. And you know what? If all the expats, if all the economic refugees all came back, I don't know, maybe there'd be a 50-50 split or something. But none of the opposition can stand against Maduro in an election. That's why they don't. That's why the CIA told them in the last election to boycott it and not show up. And then one guy ran anyway, Falcone, and he got his ass handed to him. So, which maybe was partly because of the boycott. Maybe it was just because they didn't have the votes. But in any case, the international observers said that they didn't stuff the boxes or anything like that as far as it goes. So, the real point here is that it's none of our business. It's our business as individual human beings. But as Americans with an American government that has a policy, our only role is to oppose that. Our only, like I say, I don't know of hardly anyone, even leftists, who would say that the economy there was great until America intervened. You know what I mean? I know I mentioned Greg Palast. He's absolutely a progressive. and a very big welfare state, regulatory state guy in every way. But he told the story of their economy the same way I did. High oil prices, huge obligations, low oil prices, monetary inflation. And monetary inflation leads to price inflation. And there you go, just like that. And those are just the facts. So I don't think anybody's disputing that. But when it comes to the guys trying to do the coup, they just don't have public support whatsoever. And this guy, Juan Guaido, was in the Washington Post last week saying that he is trying to open up direct lines of communication with the U.S. military in order for them to intervene and overthrow Maduro for him. And he says that there's a clause in the Constitution that says that since he doesn't like the election of last time, then Maduro, therefore, is an illegitimate president. He wasn't really elected. Therefore, the office of the presidency is vacant. Therefore, the speaker of the, I forgot the exact name for it, but their lower house can name himself president. Well, think about the direct analogy would be, and Hillary at least ran and lost. She actually even won the popular vote. But imagine if Hillary Clinton said she's calling on China's military to intervene to attack Washington, D.C., to overthrow Donald Trump and install her in power, because everybody knows the 25th Amendment says you can do that. He's incapable of being the president now, right? That would be the highest act of treason, and we would all see her hanged. Well, that's what Juan Guaido is doing. He's publicly asking the great white Yankee imperialist superpower in the North to come down to his country with its armed force and kill whoever it takes to kill until he can have the power. So how much, I mean, if anybody supported him the day before he said that, what do you think they think of him now? And in fact, he had already said that previously back after the first coup failed in January. Juan Guaido is textbook definition, dictionary definition, a traitor to the people of Venezuela. Not just to the government of Venezuela, to the current regime of Venezuela. He is a traitor to the Venezuelan people. He's calling for war against his own country, one they're sure to lose, one that's sure to include the slaughter of, you want to place bets now? How many tens or hundreds of thousands of people die before they're done? Because I'll tell you what would happen, and I'm not predicting this, by the way, but it's worth mentioning that it would take the U.S. Army and Marine Corps to invade Venezuela to get this done. CIA money is not getting this done. A couple of lucky drone strikes, that's stuff from a movie. You want a real regime change, you're going to have to invade the country and fight a standing army of, 300,000 or 400,000 men.
Well, not only that, they're all very well armed privately as well.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Chavez deliberately armed up poor leftist militias, essentially, to back him up in fear, in preparation for exactly this kind of thing.
Wait, I thought there was a big gun grab there.
It depends on who. I mean, yeah, I think they did, confiscate guns from civilians en masse, but then they armed up specific militias too. So, but yeah, you're talking about a real war. You're talking about Iraq War II in Venezuela, in the jungle.
So let's talk about some solutions here, because war is, I guess, one type of solution which nobody wants, of course, except a few, I guess, there. But in terms of, coming from the crypto side, I'm always a big fan of economic solutions and bypassing the whole money printing nonsense and trying to bring in an alternative economy through the grassroots. Do you think that is a viable option?
Yes. I mean, everybody who's got a phone can use Bitcoins and all these things. I mean, you guys are the expert on that. But I think, well, look, we know that that's the whole promise of Bitcoin, that we don't have to be tied to these national governments and their dictates. We can go around that thing. I don't know what Venezuelan participation rates are in cryptocurrencies. I would think that they'd be getting the hang of it.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, right? It just
universal there.
It seems to me that cryptocurrencies just aren't taking off there, and it seems sad because it seems like the perfect place where it should take off.
Well, it might be that they just don't trust it because they're living through an experience of having a currency they can't trust, so they just kind of maybe don't trust anything. You promise them a good replacement, they look at that skeptically too. I don't know. Well, but, I just interviewed this guy named Jose Nino, who is a Venezuelan expat here in this country. And he wrote a book called How Socialism Destroyed Venezuela and Why the U.S. Should Stay Out. Right? So confirming both of my biases. And it's a pretty good little book. And he says at the end, hey, what about secession for a solution? And what about, he says there's this region surrounding this one city, I forget, I don't know, in one part of the country where they never really have gone along with all this Chavista stuff all that much. And, so what if they just declared independence? Unless that's where all the oil is or something like that. Maybe that, which would just obviously start a war, maybe that is a solution, is further decentralization. We should always ask ourselves, how could any group of men even have the power to devalue the currency of anyone else? I mean, that's crazy that we would have our currency would be subject to the whims of men with power. That's not how things should be whatsoever. Whoever invented that? Even Jon Stewart asked Alan Greenspan. He's like, but why do you even set the interest rate anyway? I mean, it kind of seems like the market can figure out what the interest rate is. And when you set it somewhere, you're punishing one group of people and benefiting someone else, right? So that doesn't seem fair. And Jon Stewart, of course, is the quintessential Democrat, but he's just looking at that like, well, So yeah, I mean, that's absolutely how I feel about it. Everybody essentially renounce power. Don't lobby power, but lobby against it maybe. But don't lobby it to do things for you, but try to divorce yourself from it as much as you possibly can. And let me mention about the clip that you saw, Tatiana, real quick before we move on from Venezuela.
That's great. Yeah.
I want to point out that
they were kind of quote unquote bad guys.
Yeah. Well, look, they played.
It was horrible. I don't know. It was disgusting to see.
Well, so there's a couple of different points on both sides, all sides of this argument. Okay. And yes, they were throwing armored personnel carriers. And no, it wasn't throwing Molotov cocktails at the armored personnel carriers, throwing armored personnel carriers. That'd be strong. They were throwing Molotov cocktails, and they were at armored personnel carriers, not tanks. In fact, I've had 2 or 3 different people say to me, what do you think about that footage of the tanks running people over? Well, that's quite an image. But that's not what this was. This is an armored truck with big rubber tires, and none of those people, I don't think, were killed. I mean, some people have been killed in the protests or something, but in those pictures, 2 or 3 people are run over, but they didn't die because they weren't run over by a tank. They were run over by a truck, and they were picking a fight. Now, all other things being equal, I'm in favor of the civilian and against the guy in the armored personnel carrier. He's an armored personnel carrier. He should sit there and take it or get out and run or something, but he shouldn't be running people down with the thing. So it is horrible. You're right to be disgusted by it. I'm not trying to make excuses for it, but I am talking about what was actually going on there. It wasn't a tank, and it wasn't a peaceful protest. And what do you think would happen if you started throwing Molotov cocktails at Austin police in their armored personnel carrier, which they have? In fact, I guarantee in your town they have armored personnel carriers, their local police department. And if you threw if you threw Molotov cocktails at them, they would kill you. They would shoot you in the face. They wouldn't even have a chance to run you over. You'd already be dead before their tire got to your corpse. So I'm not justifying it, but I'm just saying it's a little bit of context for what you're really seeing there. And look at what you're not seeing. You're not seeing a sea of hundreds of thousands and millions of people saying, yay for the revolution, let's overthrow the government. You're not seeing that. You're seeing maybe a few hundred people. And then what else are you seeing? That same clip over and over and over again. All day long. CNN, MSNBC, Fox News, the PBS NewsHour, every channel. This one 15-second clip, if that, maybe 10-second clip, devoid of context. Sometimes you see a little bit of a Molotov cocktail fire going in the clip, but usually not. And so that ought to tell you everything right there. They're lying to you. They're manipulating you. All of Fox, CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, they all have one pool camera in all of Caracas to share. And it only has this one view of 15 seconds of an armored personnel carrier running a couple of people over, apparently. And they can't show you anything else going on in Caracas that day. They just can't. What does that tell you? It tells you that they're lying to you. It tells you that in the rest of Caracas, people either support the government or they're just going about their day, that there is no revolution. There is no uprising. This thing is a fraud and a con. And in fact, look what happened. Nothing happened. Guaido, for the third time, remember the stun at the border. For the third time in 5 months, Guaido said, I am the president. Government and military, follow me now. And they all said, no. What are you talking about? And Guaido held a protest in the richest, whitest part of town. I know that from journalists who've been there numerous times. Greg Palast said this would be like if you had a big protest in Beverly Hills. Oh, wow, we're so impressed. How does the rest of L.A. feel?
Wow.
And so in this case, yeah, they got a big protest of a couple of 10,000 people out there. And I posted the clips. It's all over Twitter. And I posted the clips on my Libertarian Institute blog of the drone footage, where there's no question that there's at least 200,000 or 300,000 people outside of the presidential palace, a gigantic march. Everybody's wearing red hats, make Venezuela great again or whatever, and supporting Maduro and opposing the coup. Their protest put the opposition's protest to absolute shame. It just made a mockery of the entire idea that what the people of Venezuela want is for America to come and change their regime for them. It's just not true.
Wow. So I feel like we have so many things that I want to cover, and I definitely want to get to Iran. But one more question about Venezuela. Why does the U.S. have such an interest in messing with Venezuela? I mean,
Oil.
Is it really that simple?
Yeah, but see, here's the thing. And liberals always screw this up. Liberals would have you believe that this is your fault because you need a cheap price of a tank of gas so you can get to work in the morning. You greedy, wealthy, privileged, first world white person, blah, blah, blah. But that's not what it is. Again, the national interest and the interests of the people in power, especially in our system, have nothing to do with each other. Okay? George Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump don't care if you can get to work at an affordable price, other than right before election day. You'll see them go to the Saudis and say, hey, increase production and give me a couple extra quarters off of that gallon of gas this week. You'll see that happen before every major election. But again, that's just for their own interests. They don't care about you. They don't care about us. That's not what it's about. What it is about is first and foremost American dominance over the world's supply of oil for strategic reasons. As I said, Russia, they export. They've got plenty of oil. But the Chinese have virtually none, which is kind of surprising. You look at the landmass of China, and there's no oil under there? Huh. Okay. They got to import virtually all of it. And so if there's ever a war with China, the USA wants to be able to choke off their fuel immediately. That means in the Persian Gulf. That means in East Africa and in West Africa. And that means in Venezuela. And that means in Texas. And that means in the Brits, North Sea, and wherever else. We want to be able to turn the energy off, and if you read their documents, you see where they talk about this quite openly. Like, for example, the colonization of Africa that's going on right now. It's sort of a pseudo colonization. We're not moving our civilian population there, but our government is either waging war against countries or is embedding with their militaries and training up their militaries and using their militaries to gain a major position of dominance all over Africa. And you can find where the leaders of Central Command say, we're doing this because we need to dominate these oil resources to keep them out of the hands of the Chinese, so that if there's ever a conflict with the Chinese, we can cut off their access, right? That's not a conspiracy theory. They say that when they have a big speech at the big conference about the future of the U.S. Army in Africa. What are we doing there? We're keeping the oil out of the hands of the Chinese. Okay, thank you for being honest. Then there's also the money.
Or any other country. These are sort of like esoteric questions. But I don't know. It just seems funny to be dividing people. Like, I hate the Chinese. It seems so old-fashioned, But I guess, I don't know. What's the point of that? To have like the biggest, mightiest army to kill the most people?
Well,
why even worry about them? And
to rule the world, it's just like Pinky and the Brain, man. It's nothing less than total domination. They call it, the U.S. military calls it full spectrum dominance. America is not satisfied with being a world empire. The American grand strategy, at least since the end of the Cold War, is to dominate the entire planet Earth. And so if Iran and Russia and China, North Korea, Cuba, and Venezuela are still, and used to be Iraq, if they're independent from us, then that has to change. Virtually every other state in the world is compliant. America doesn't really control India, but we don't really have any major problems with them either. They help us balance against China, so the USA isn't too concerned about them. But all of Europe and all of Africa and all of Latin America and everybody is under the American fold, the American system of international financial, what have you, through all of the Bank for International Settlements, the IMF and the World Bank. They obey America's dictates in the United Nations Security Council 90% of the time, virtually any question. And, look at the war in Afghanistan and the war in Libya, where these are fought by NATO, where we get all these NATO countries that have no dog in the fight in Afghanistan whatsoever. They're fighting with us for 18 years now. And that's because America dominates all of Western Europe. And I guess they figure the compromise is worth it because they like us better than being dominated by the Germans. The Germans like having us in there to help keep the Russians out. And everybody has their own interest on their side of using the American empire too. But from that point of view, independence is just not allowed. It's like crazy King George III saying, you may not declare independence from us. So that's the deal. Venezuela is part of that. Russia and China still. They're not communist anymore. I mean, the Communist Party still rules China, but they're much more a brown fascist party than a corporatist, totalitarian fascist party. The Russians are essentially run by conservative Republicans now. I mean, they're not even really fascists. They're essentially not too much different than the American system in terms of the big, which you could call America fascist too, I guess, but it's a participatory fascism, as Robert Higgs says. Certainly we don't have a real ideological conflict with Russia. It's just that their president refuses to bend the knee. And so what do? They accuse him of being the secret controller of the American president, just because the American president isn't hell-bent on making him bend the knee. And so that's what this is all about. At the end of the day, that's what it's all about. But it's also, and never forget, about money. And oil is just like on the Beverly Hillbillies. It's black gold. It's free money.
Yeah, and I guess they wouldn't be invading or talking about invasion if Venezuela was just a poppy rich.
That's right. They wouldn't care at all. They could crucify their if they have money and they're compliant with us, they could crucify their Shia and we wouldn't care at all. But yeah, as long as, and you know what? It's actually quite funny. You can look this up, no problem. Just John Bolton, Fox News, Venezuela oil. It'll come right up. And John Bolton, the current sitting national security advisor to the president of the United States, said on Fox News, he goes, well, what we want to do is we want to turn all those oil companies or all of the Venezuelan oil over to American companies. And he claims, this is ridiculous, he claims that this would be a great benefit to the U.S. economy. Right. Again, pretending like this is for you. This is to benefit you. He goes, this would be great for the American economy if we could have American companies take over that oil. And then so we could essentially, he says, we could have the oil and the money too. We can just steal it all. And now you guys know that at best we're talking about what, a few tens of billions of dollars a year, maybe $100 billion a year. I don't know, at the limit. So that doesn't have any great effect on the U.S. economy at all. The people of Montana or whatever, they're not living better or worse depending on whether Exxon is in control of the production of Venezuela's oil. It has nothing to do with the national interest in that sense. But boy, that's a lot of money if you're an executive vice president at Exxon in charge of stealing people's oil and money. Then you did great. And, the Koch brothers have a big interest in this. They're libertarian patrons of so many people in our movement. But they have an oil refinery in Corpus Christi that is completely engineered toward filthy, heavy Venezuelan crude and is not really set up to refine Saudi light crude or any other kind of oil. So they're totally dependent on Venezuela to supply, their what they refine. And so, as Greg Palast explained to me, Chavez knew that he had a total captive market in the Koch brothers. And so he would stick it to them. He'd be giving oil away for free to the Cubans, even to people in New York. Remember that when oil prices were really high, he's giving away subsidized oil to Americans and all this. But then he's charging the Kochs double, or I don't know, double, but he's increasing the price on them and sticking it to them as hard as he can without getting overthrown, I guess. But that was, Chavez loved to kind of torture them because he knew that they were a captive market. And so I think Palast, the implication there is Maduro was kind of the same way, but he wasn't nearly as good at it. Chavez knew when to back off Maduro was a bit too ham-handed. And so I don't know the direct causation as far as, the Kochs being behind this policy, but they do support a lot of not just libertarian organizations, but a lot of conservative organizations as well. I will point out that Ted Carpenter and Doug Bandow and all the guys at the Cato Institute are perfect on this. They're absolutely 100% against American intervention there. So those guys have integrity. I don't know if they even are, have faced any pressure at all, but if they have certainly not given into it.
So now we've been hearing about Iran, and everybody wants to go to Iran, and I'm not paying that much attention. So I'm saying, wait, what? Why are we fighting with Iran now? And it doesn't seem like a good idea. And some people are saying, oh, it could get really bad. Some people are saying no big deal. Obviously, you're going to guess where I'm going to fall on it. But why should I be concerned? What's going on with Iran? And should I be concerned? Do you think it's just a bunch of...
Right, yeah. No, listen, your attitude is perfectly justified. Well, what do you mean we got a problem? We got to fight Iran all of a sudden. What did they do? But nobody has an answer because they didn't do anything. USA is the empire, not Iran.
Well, if anybody did something bad, I feel like it's the Saudis. Like, they're definitely doing bad things. They're chopping off heads of little teenagers and stuff. That seems like something we should go in there. I haven't heard about Iran doing anything crazy like that.
Yeah, well, that's certainly not a reason to attack Saudi Arabia, but it's certainly a reason to not support them. And it's certainly a reason to look sideways at any claim that the reason America would intervene in Iran is because we love the people of Iran so much, we're trying to save them from their regime. And it's just nonsense. And the behavior of the Saudis across the Gulf there, America's, best allies in the region, closest allies in the region, is all the proof you need right there.
There's plenty of countries in the world with extreme despots chopping off people's heads, but they're not oil rich.
Yeah. And look at who the Saudis are chopping the heads off of, a bunch of Shia. So if the Americans love the Shiites so much in that they're willing to go to war with Iran to save the Iranian people from their own government, how come they won't even make a phone call to the Saudis to say, hey, man, why don't you just keep these people in prison instead of murdering them in public in a way that draws bad attention to what we're doing here? They can't even be bothered to do that. They don't care at all about this Shia of Saudi. So why should we believe for a moment that they care about the Shiite population of Iran? They hate Iran because Iran declared independence from the American empire in 1979. That's their sin. That's what it is. And people bring up the hostage crisis from 79-80. And people will bring up the Beirut barracks bombing from 1983 because they didn't do anything to us since then. They didn't do anything. It was Saudis and Egyptians that knocked our towers down, not Iranians.
Man, well, do you think we're going to end up going to war with them?
No, I don't. I think, basically, it's true that John Bolton would like to see a war there. And I don't have any doubt that the Israelis are pushing hard for this. They're the ones who came up with the bogus intel that the recent scare is over and so forth. There's a brand new one in the American Conservative by Gareth Porter, of course, explaining all of this. I mean, essentially, there's nothing to fight about, Tatiana. The same reason that you're surprised by this. What, all of a sudden Iran again? We're going to attack Iran for what? Exactly. For what? They didn't do anything. And the reason the Americans really hate them so much is just because they can't attack them. This country's 3 times the size of Iraq, maybe 4, has 3 times the population. It's not flat desert. It's mountains. It's flat deserts too, but it's mountains too. And this is a population that has not been under full blockade the way Iraq was. I mean, Iraq was decimated in Iraq War I in 1991. They were under a 10-year blockade after that under Bill Clinton's regime. And then George Bush invaded and smashed them. They were helpless before American power. The Iranians, not so much. Now, all they have for planes are old F-4s and F-14s that Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford gave them back when their government were the sock puppets of the Americans in the 70s. And they have 1 battleship, I think, but they have a lot of missiles, including supersonic sea-skimming missiles. And we have a lot of guys within range, right? There are no Iranian military bases in Canada or Mexico, but there are American military bases all throughout the Gulf. And, Kuwait, Oman, Saudi still. And of course, Qatar has a massive Air Force base, and Bahrain hosts the Navy's 5th Fleet. All of that stuff is within range. The Americans at the Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan are right within range. The Americans who are still fighting with the Shiites, with the Iranian-backed militias in Iraq against what's left of ISIS and the Sunni insurgency there now, are right there, not even within missile range. They're right there within bayonet range to be stabbed right in the back by the Iraqi army that they're working with. That is also Iranian-backed ever since George Bush invaded and built this thing in 2003. So that's what this is all about. Okay? That's what it's all about. George Bush and all these guys, all these neocons who put Israel first, they hate Iran. They're obsessed with Iran. But then their war in Iraq, which was supposed to give America dominance over Iraq, over the Iraqi Shiite supermajority, and therefore over Iran, completely backfired and blew up in their face. Of course, it only empowered Iran in Iraq. America fought an entire war, Iraq War II. The whole point of that war, the whole end result of that war is that USA put Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad, built an army for them and everything. Well, ever since then, they've been spitting mad that they're so stupid that that's what they did. It wasn't supposed to turn out like that. America was supposed to win at the end, not Iran, but they won the war, but for their enemy. So now they're essentially a bunch of crybabies. And so what do? Obama backs literal Al-Qaeda suicide bomber terrorists for 6 years in Syria, just because Assad, the dictator of Syria, was an ally of Iran. So if George Bush gave them Baghdad, we'll take away Damascus. Well, they got 500,000 people killed, and it actually didn't work. In fact, Iran and their allies in Hezbollah have more power and influence inside Syria now than ever before. They were just friends and allies. Now Syria is entirely dependent on Iranian special operations forces, essentially, to save his bacon, to keep him from getting overthrown by CIA-backed Al-Qaeda suicide bombers. Yes, in an era after 9/11, in an era after 4,000 Americans died fighting against the Al-Qaeda-led Sunni insurgency in Iraq War II. The American government hates Iran more than they hate the American people's enemies, who they also created for us in Al-Qaeda. And they will side with Al-Qaeda against these guys. And they're doing the same thing in Yemen right now. I mean, Trump, to his credit, at least called off support for Al-Qaeda in Syria, but he's still flying as their Air Force and floating around as their Navy in Yemen to this day. Half the war, under Obama, 2 years of war under Obama, now more than 2 years of war under Trump, continuing the same policy on and fighting against the Shiites on behalf of not just the Sunnis, but actual sworn bin Ladenites, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. The guys that blew up the USS Cole in 2000, the guys that tried to blow up the airliner over Detroit with the underpants bomb on Christmas Day 2009 and had 2 more package bomb plots, and who had helped to organize, I think, at least 2 of the massacres in France from 2015, the Charlie Hebdo, and then one of the other ones, I think the one where they attacked the concert, the Eagles of Death Metal or whatever concert there. Mm-hmm. These were organized by Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Real bin Ladenite, anti-Western, civilian slaughtering terrorists. And right now, the U.S. Air Force is flying as their cover in battle against their greatest enemies, the Houthis, who never did anything to us but are friends with Iran.
Crazy.
So either I'm crazy or they're crazy, and it ain't me. I'm just sitting here just as flabbergasted as you.
So, Josh, I know you have a good question, but I wanted to ask this first because I think it's going to lead up to it. You said earlier that, Iran is weaponized, and in a way, it almost seems like that's ironically a way to ensure more safety in the region. On the other hand, the U.S. citizen has a lot more rights than somebody in the Middle East, for example. Do you think that there's how do you basically, America is great if you're in America. America's horrible if you're in another place. Do you think it's good that these other countries are preparing to, get invaded by us? Does that keep a check on our aggression? Or do you think that, in fact, if the U.S. was popular there, that it would become better and then they would all of a sudden get our rights?
Okay, so it's like this. I mean, yes, it's true that if the Iranians had just a completely lackadaisical attitude about this, then America probably would sense weakness and come for them. I mean, the reality is they know that Iran can hit back. And to be very clear here, They do not have nukes. They've never had nukes. They've never even attempted to make nuclear bombs. And everybody knows that. And anybody who says opposite of that is either lying to you or is a damn fool. Okay? Simple as that. It's not a question of nukes. The worst you could say about them is that they have worked to create a latent nuclear capability. So they do know how to enrich uranium. So if we ever attack them for no reason, then we could, you could expect the regime change to fail, and you could expect the regime to then attempt, at least, to make nuclear weapons. Right now, they're hoping that half a deterrent is enough because they don't really want nukes anyway. Just like most countries in the world don't really want nukes anyway. And, their supreme leader, and look, I'm not saying anyone should trust this, okay? But there are facts that bear this out too. That the mean old supreme leader, the scary original supreme leader from the 1980s, Khomeini, that he had issued a religious edict saying that it is haram to build weapons of mass destruction. No chemical weapons, no biological weapons, and no atom bombs. That it is, sinful. It is banned by the religion of Islam, according to the supreme leader, Grand Ayatollah, right? Sort of like if the Pope was the president and said, not just are we not making nukes, but I say that God says we can't make nukes. Now, you could be very cynical about that and say, I don't give a damn what Ayatollah says. I don't believe him any further than I could throw him, and I can't throw him that far. I would agree with that. Not only is he a religious leader, who I don't believe what religious leaders say, but also he's a politician. So I really don't believe him. On the other hand, I think it's really true that he said that. And I think that evidence has borne out that his government has obeyed that. And his government at the time, they wanted to make chemical weapons to counter Saddam Hussein, who was armed, of course, with American chemical weapons and was using them against the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq war. And his government came to him and said, we want to build chemical weapons. And he said, no, you can't. And atom bombs either. And Gareth Porter, of course, has a great report about that, all about in foreignpolicy.com, about the Ayatollah and the nukes. But anyways, yes, they do have this deterrent to keep us out. And if the government of Venezuela, of Iran, if the supreme leader said, okay, that's it, we're instituting the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Bill of Rights because you got me, your system is better than ours, our republic is more flawed than yours, so we're going to do things along your model now, that wouldn't convince America to not invade, because it's not about the freedom and the rights of the people of Iran whatsoever. Again, in terms of political rights, certainly the people of Iran have many and much more than almost anyone else in the region. And the supreme leader is a religious theocrat supreme leader. No question about that he's at the top. But they have regular elections all the time, including for their president and for their parliament. And it is a very flawed republic, just like ours. You guys know how hard it is for a libertarian to get on a ballot, or for an anti-establishment Republican or Democrat to make it through the primary, hurdles. We saw the way at the highest level, the way the DNC intervened against Sanders for Hillary, for example, last time, this kind of thing. They have stuff like that in Iran. But again, compare it to the kingdom of Saudi Arabia across the way. Or how about the Sultanate of Oman? Or any of the little princelings that rule in the United Arab Emirates? The king of Bahrain, the king of Qatar, the king of Kuwait. I mean, the fact that the USA backs any kings at all anywhere in the world ought to tell you that something is terribly wrong here. But anyway, this isn't about freeing the people of Iran. This is about the U.S. government, the U.S. empire taking control over the government of Iran. If we can't get them to bend their knee and obey our dictates, then we will get a regime change. I mean, look at Cuba. We could have made friends with the Cubans a long time ago. We could have killed them with kindness. Hey, 50 years ago, 60, 70 even. What years again? So let's see, 40, 50, 60, 60 years ago. Yeah. We could have figured out a way in the last 60 years to get along with Cuba, but no. The lesson is, if you stand up to us, we'll kill you. If you try to remain independent from the USA, one way or the other, we are going to change that with force. You know, Noam Chomsky has written too that was a major part of the war in Vietnam. Everybody knew that Vietnam really meant nothing to the USA. And everybody knew the whole domino theory was BS. Thailand wasn't going commie. You know what I mean? They knew that. The domino effect, if one country goes red, they all will, and all this. That wasn't it. Ike Eisenhower had tried to say, well, if Vietnam goes red, we'll have to pay the market price for tungsten. I mean, really? You're going to go to an entire war, a genocidal war against Vietnam for tungsten? No, it wasn't that either. And it wasn't even, you know, Gareth Porter's thesis is it's all about Pentagon budget dollars for the Navy and the Marine Corps and this kind of thing. I agree with that too. But Noam Chomsky said it was about making an example out of them. That if you try to tell us no, if you try to kick us out, if you try to be independent from the American empire, we will decimate your society. We will carpet bomb you. We will cause such grief and suffering that everyone else better heed the example of the Vietnamese, that this is what happens when you stand up to Uncle Sam. So
do you think there's, going to be another false flag to get the American people behind them, something like the Gulf of Tonkin to get into Vietnam? Or do you think, because like Tatiana said, why should I care? Are they a threat? And there's no real support for any sort of invasion into Venezuela or into Iran. And if they're really hell-bent on going into these countries, do you think there would be some type of false flag?
Well, listen, I think the short answer is no. But to elaborate, it's because your eyes are wide open for that kind of thing. And so many people are looking out for that. And, Colonel Douglas McGregor, who's a regular, he's a conservative anti-war guy, and is a regular on the Tucker Carlson show, essentially looked into the camera and said, Mr. President, you need to really be on the lookout for a Gulf of Tonkin type incident here to try to provoke a conflict that I know that you don't want, sir. Hey, all right. That's exactly what needs to happen on Fox News right there. That's probably the best thing that ever happened on Fox News was McGregor warning the president himself. Because, see, I don't think Donald Trump wants a war. Look, if George Bush could have attacked Iran, he would have. But the Joint Chiefs told him that, man, we don't want to. This is biting off more than we can chew, man. You start the war, then what? You can't end it. There's no good way to end it. You know what? Have a few weeks of airstrikes and then stop? I mean, and they better just sit there and take it rather than retaliate. And we can count on them being too smart to resist if we launch a war against them? I mean, yeah, no. And I think certainly back 10 years ago, the Air Force was like, yeah, let me at him, Uncle Scooby. But the Marine Corps and the Army were like, no, we just finished. We're not even finished fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these are, my Marines that got to die on the ground there while your little, Air Force pilots and Navy flyers are having their fun. Marines and Army and special operations guys on the ground got to do all the dying, and they tend to object to that. Fighting the Taliban is bad enough, and to them, really nothing. But compared to invading Persia, man, yeah, I don't think so. And so I think, again, that's the whole frustration here, is that we can't have a war with Iran. And so the U.S. government is just beside themselves trying to figure out a way to get them to be compliant. And I don't want to be too sanguine about it. It could happen. But just like with Venezuela, I'm not here to be an alarmist and tell you I fear that this is going to happen right now and you better give me money or else it's going to, or some kind of thing. I'm virtually certain that we're not going to have war with either of these countries. But at the same time, it's because people are fighting against it and people are informing each other why not to go along. Because there's no question that there are interests and powerful factions and people in this country and in the Middle East who very much would like to see America fight Iran. I just have to bet on the side of sanity here that, as all morality aside, but just being factual about it, when George Bush says to Tommy Franks, hey, can we invade Iraq from Kuwait and pretty much stomp the Iraqi army and take Baghdad in a few weeks? Tommy Franks is like, yeah. And that much was true. You know, the Iraqi army was a pushover. The war against the Iraqi state in 2003 was a cakewalk. It was just taking over the place that didn't work out so well, taking sides in the Civil War and staying in all of these things. But no military leaders could promise that to Donald Trump, that like, yeah, we're going to go in there and it'll be great. That's not what they're saying. I know that's not what they're telling him. So he could do that anyway. You know, someone gave me an important example on the show one time about how the generals told Franklin Roosevelt, we're not going back to Europe. We are not going back to Europe. And Franklin Roosevelt said, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. We're going back to Europe. Yeah,
well,
get ready.
That brings up a good question, because we're coming up on an hour and a half now. So I want to wrap up, but I have one final question. People that serve in the military have American values. And I'm sure, as we even see with the support for Ron Paul, they're pretty much libertarian, especially on foreign policy. Do you think that the military will walk away from these kinds of engagements at any point? I mean,
no.
Never? No. You think they're just brainwashed forever?
No, their loyalty is to the Constitution. I mean, look, right now recruitment rates are way down. And so you will see, you know, people seeking to get out. You'll see, you know, at some point or another, you'll see higher or lower numbers of conscientious objectors and people just deciding to retire now rather than wait for their pension and, you know, just quitting overall. But will you see American combat divisions of any kind refuse orders to fight? Never. Because look, it's not that they're libertarians. Look at the support for Ron Paul. It's not that they're libertarians. It's that they swore their oath to the Constitution and they really mean it. They were made to shout it, you know, I really mean this over and over again and this kind of thing. And it's a big deal. I mean, an armed force, this is murderous power. And so they must be kept in line, right, with discipline, with honor, with strict loyalty, real loyalty to the Constitution itself. So when Ron Paul says, hey, the Constitution says we're supposed to be a republic, not an empire, and we're supposed to fight for defense of our freedoms and our families, not to be the dominant power in the Middle East, they go, hey, that's smart. That sounds right to me. I like that. And I don't want to fight for nothing. I want to fight, but I don't want to fight for nothing. That's how Army guys feel. So they'll go along with that. But what else does the Constitution say? We're talking about guys who are in the military. The Constitution says that the president, the civilian elected president of the United States, he is the chief general in charge.
But what if the president is violating the Constitution? I mean, they keep doing it. They've been doing it for years. I mean, little by little, they're kind of chipping away at that.
Well, you're right. I mean, I think, you know what? I mean, so really every war since Korea has been fought without a declaration of war. The theory is now that the UN Charter and a United Nations resolution and an authorization to use force, sometimes after the fact, sometimes they don't get one at all. In Libya and in Kosovo, they never even got an authorization at all. But most of the time they go, well, we just passed this authorization. We let the president decide to use force, and it's a United Nations resolution that makes it legal to start a war, and this kind of thing. And so that's true. And yet ever since Truman, I mean, the idea that any general would refuse to deploy on the orders of their president is just absolutely unthinkable. And if they did, they would be immediately arrested. And, you know, America is a corrupt empire in so many ways, but it's not a banana republic. You know what I mean? At the end of the day, they will do what they're told. And that's right. The problem with Trump is Trump goes, I want out of Syria. And they go, yeah. And they kind of drag along and take their time. And then they announce that they don't really want to leave. They want to leave some troops. So they will push back a bit. Although you see, that's the other way. They were even worse than him on it. But then he doesn't have the wherewithal to say, I'm the boss and I said out. If he really did that, they would leave. If he really did that, they would never think of disobeying the elected president under essentially any circumstances. But it's just having an elected president that would demand that they do the right thing, that would issue them orders that say, float home, fly home. This is over now.
Do you still think he's the most anti-war candidate, or rather president, that we've had? Like, do you think Tulsi would be any better?
No, Trump's horrible. Jimmy Carter is, well, see, this is all Jimmy Carter's fault for backing Saddam's invasion of Iran and for backing the the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and all this. But at the same time, he didn't launch any real wars himself. These are terrible proxy wars and CIA actions. But in his 4 years, and really Ronald Reagan, as crazy as it sounds, with his nuclear buildup and everything, and his support for horrible death squads in Latin America, as well as support for Saddam Hussein in Iraq and some other things. But he never launched any real major American wars, right? He invaded Grenada. So that could have been a lot worse. But George Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush, and Barack Obama, these guys have piles of skulls, tens, hundreds of thousands of people. And Donald Trump is just like them. When the only reason that Iraq War III has wound down now is just because it's winding down. Obama passed that war off to Trump at a time where they were almost ready to attack Mosul, but they had already kicked ISIS out of Fallujah, Ramadi, and most of the cities in western Iraq. But Donald Trump expanded the war in Afghanistan. He added 1,000 troops to the war in Afghanistan. He is trying to negotiate a way out of there now. I won't sell him short on that. He really is trying to negotiate a way out of that war. I'll give him credit, but still, we're having this conversation 2.5 years into his presidency, and the troops are still there, and there are more rotating in and out all the time. The numbers are not decreasing. So, and the violence is, the UN report just came out saying more civilian casualties caused by the Americans last year than by the Taliban by far, and among the highest levels in the war, because they just put the war back up in the air. Since they have fewer guys on the ground, it just means they're doing airstrikes and killing more innocent people there. He expanded the war in really both wars in Yemen, the war for and against Al-Qaeda, but especially the war for Al-Qaeda against the Houthis there, which is just a genocidal siege campaign. It's just horrible. And he expanded the war in Somalia, sending actual infantry area while he's threatening Iran and threatening Venezuela. He is making peace with Korea. Could be doing better, but I absolutely appreciate his turn on that. But he could make peace with Assad, with the Ayatollah, with Maduro, and with the rest of these guys. We could deal with every rogue state as on an equal peer basis in the world and get along. We don't have to have any of these conflicts at all.
Well, this has been a really awesome episode. I don't know which one is my favorite. I want to have you come back and talk about 100 other places that we're invading, because I love getting more educated about this. If people want to follow your work and support you, where do they go? What are the links?
ScottHorton.org, Antiwar.com, foolserrand.us for the book, and the Libertarian Institute. That's me and the heroic Sheldon Richman over there, and a great little group of writers at libertarianinstitute.org.
Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our sponsors, Voltoro and blocktap.io. If you guys are interested in this episode or other episodes, thetatianashow.com. You can listen to the Bob Murphy episode we referenced. There's other interviews with Scott that are really awesome. Make sure you go to Voltoro and check out what they're doing over there. My sites are tatianamoroz.com for my music, and cryptomediahub.com, which is also a sponsor of the show, marketing and PR agency. Thanks everybody for listening in, and we'll catch you next time. Tuesdays, the Tatiana Show. Tatiana Show Tuesdays. Hey
there, it's time for the show, the Tatiana Show, where you make friends and talk life and crypto. We gotta think and reflect and use lots of intellect with our hearts when we work together. I know that it can be so hard out there, looking all around and saying that life ain't fair. So that is why we will fight and stay up late at night, listening to the Tatiana Show. This episode of the Tatiana Show is brought to you by Voltoro. Visit Voltoro.com and start today. That is vault, like a gold vault, and oro, which is Spanish for gold. Voltoro, ole! What's the point of all this technology without a little love in our lives? Our hosts, Tatiana Moroz, Dr. Stephanie Murphy, and Lauren Kasovitz,
have come together to bring you Proof of Love. Go to proofoflovecast.com. Thank you for listening to The Tatiana Show. Please follow us on Twitter at Queen Tatiana or on Facebook and Instagram at Tatiana Moroz Music. More episodes can be found at thetatianashow.com, and make sure you leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends. The Tatiana Show has been brought to you by CryptoMediaHub.com, a boutique marketing and PR agency for Bitcoin and beyond.